On Saturday, 28-year-old Ismaaiyl Brinsley killed two New York City police officers in the Bed-Stuy neighborhood of Brooklyn here in New York City, supposedly in revenge for the death of Eric Garner and the shooting of Michael Brown. Ismaaiyl approached the passenger window of an NYPD police vehicle, shot the two officers sitting inside multiple times at point-blank range in their heads and upper bodies with a semi-automatic handgun. The two dead officers were identified as 40-year-old Rafael Ramos and 32-year-old Wenjian Liu. Brinsley then reportedly killed himself with that same handgun as NYPD officers responding to the scene closed in on him in the New York City subway. The shooting occurred right after New York City police officer Daniel Pantaleo, who was involved in the choking death of Eric Garner, was not charged with any crime, a grand jury choosing not to indict. That led to protests, and subsequently, Ismaaiyl Brinsley, 28, who had a long criminal record, estranged from his family prior to the shooting, born in Brooklyn, had an arrest record for weapons possession and robbery, 19 prior arrests in Georgia and Ohio, reportedly shot and seriously wounded his ex-girlfriend before arriving in Brooklyn by bus, and then committed the act which was reported on widely by media over the last several days, killing these two police officers. Very varied reactions to this. President Obama said, quote, "I unconditionally condemn the murder of two police officers in New York City." Asa Garner, the widow of Eric Garner, said, "I know what they're going through to lose a loved one right before the holidays, and everything is so sad. And I would ask that everyone who is protesting with us, please protest in a nonviolent way. My husband was not a violent man, so we don't want any violence connected to his name." The president of the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, Patrick Lynch, blamed New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio for this shooting, saying that the protesters and Bill de Blasio are to blame because they created an atmosphere of hostility towards the police. Along the lines of former Governor George Pataki, a Republican, he blamed current officials, including Mayor de Blasio, quote, "He is sickened by these barbaric acts, which are sadly a predictable outcome of divisive anti-cop rhetoric of Eric Holder and Mayor de Blasio." Former Mayor Rudy Giuliani, a Republican, accused President Obama of creating a hostile environment towards police. And this is just, it's such a sad situation, first of all, obviously a sad situation. But what's even more sad to me is that you have blame being thrown around haphazardly, making something incredibly political, and blaming protesters. The police have blamed protesters for creating this atmosphere which led to this shooting. Rudy Giuliani has blamed protesters. Even the police union has purportedly declared war in a wider statement, saying that now, because of the protests, the New York Police Department is effectively a wartime police department, and they will act accordingly. What about blaming the actual shooter? There seems to be very little of that going on in these so-called analyses that are being done.
People like to ask hypotheticals in situations like this. If there were no protests, would he have had the idea to shoot these police? If the police never, killed Brown or Garner, would he have had this reaction?
If it would have been more difficult, if it were more difficult for him to bring a gun from Maryland, would he have had the means to make these attacks? All of these hypotheticals seem to be ignoring the fact that when we have widespread anti-abortion protests and one guy kills abortion doctor George Tiller, it's a lone wolf. That man and that man alone is responsible. Anti-abortion sentiment, which has been fomented by religious and socially conservative groups, are not to blame at all. However, we have a guy show up and kill police officers who weren't even involved in the Garner situation. And who's to blame? Protesters. Barack Obama, for example, Bill de Blasio to blame. In the abortion killing, for example, of Dr. George Tiller, as insane as it is, as insane as the logic is, George Tiller was directly connected to abortions in the sense that he was an abortion doctor. Here we have an even more tenuous link. We have a man being blamed for the killings of police officers who had nothing to do with the Eric Garner protests, and everybody but the shooter are to blame. The protesters are to blame. Barack Obama is to blame. What a ridiculous double standard once again.
Yes, people will use this for their own means, to their own ends. And I think, unfortunately, now you're going to have police who are even quicker to pull those trigger fingers.
We've already heard
statements.
We've already heard the statements about how now police are going to have to be even particularly careful around black people, around Muslims, around any protesters of any kind. They're going to have to tolerate a lot less when it comes to protesting. We know the direction this is going.
Yeah, and I can see someone, some frantic person who's lost, running up to a police car window to ask for directions and just getting shot in the face because they're so terrified.